The soft hum of activity at Charles de Gaulle Airport carried through the early morning air. Travelers moved briskly through the terminal, dragging their luggage with practiced precision, their faces focused, their eyes fixed on departure screens. Amidst the noise, one man walked slowly, deliberately, without urgency or entourage. His clothes were modest, neat slacks, a crisp white shirt, and a dark, weathered blazer that looked more practical than presidential. No tie. No flash. Just presence. Few noticed him. Fewer still would have guessed who he really was. To the average passerby, he appeared to be just another man flying home from business in Paris. A quiet professional, maybe. A teacher, perhaps. No cameras followed. No security trailed behind. No special access lanes or assistants cleared his path. He carried a single leather satchel, well worn at the edges, the kind that spoke of years of function over form. And that was exactly how he wanted it. President Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, did not believe in showmanship. His leadership had never been built on gold-plated vehicles or bulletproof barriers. He led a nation scarred by colonial exploitation, struggling to reclaim its dignity, and he had chosen to do so not by sitting above his people, but among them. In every gesture, he reflected that principle. As he approached the check-in counter, he offered the agent a polite smile and handed over his passport. She glanced at it, barely lifting her eyes from the screen. A slight pause, then a mechanical nod. "Merci, monsieur," she said, unaware that she had just cleared a sitting head of state. He didn't correct her. He thanked her kindly, took his boarding pass, and moved along without a word. In the waiting area, he found an empty seat near a window. The clouds hung heavy outside, whispering of rain. Around him, the usual sounds of travel: snack wrappers, rolling bags, children tugging at parents, last-minute phone calls. A businessman argued with someone over Bluetooth. A young couple took selfies beside the boarding gate sign. A tired mother closed her eyes for a moment of peace. Traoré sat still, hands resting in his lap, his gaze fixed not on his phone, but on the world outside. He was alone, but not lonely. Silent, but not absent. It wasn't lost on him what this moment represented. For centuries, his continent had been dismissed, exploited, spoken over. His own country had faced condescension dressed as diplomacy, control disguised as aid. He had come to France not to beg, not to bow, but to speak truth, to engage with dignity, and now, to leave quietly, with no headlines, no deals signed in gold ink, and no staged photo ops. Just his conscience and his country's future in mind. When boarding was called, he waited. Not the first to rise, not the last. He stepped into the queue with the rest of business class, calmly adjusting the strap of his satchel. As he walked toward the plane, no one stopped to salute or shake his hand. No VIP escorts. No whispers of recognition. But behind those quiet eyes was the soul of a nation, a man who had survived assassination plots, who had stood firm against foreign interference, who had chosen sovereignty over submission. And now, without fanfare, he was stepping into a moment that would soon ripple across continents. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. The air inside the cabin of the Air France flight was cool and quiet, the kind of sterile calm that blankets premium air travel. Business class was already half full with passengers who had boarded early, suits and briefcases, silk scarves and soft leather shoes, soft murmurs over champagne glasses and the rustling of newspapers. It was a bubble of privilege high above the noise of economy, a sanctuary for the well-connected and the well-accustomed. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the cabin and moved toward his seat, 2A, by the window. He nodded respectfully to a man seated in 2B, a middle-aged financier by the look of him, hunched over his phone, scrolling through emails with intensity. The man barely registered him. That, too, was expected. Traoré placed his satchel in the overhead compartment with deliberate care, taking only a book with him as he sat down and fastened his seatbelt. It was a novel, dog-eared and bookmarked with a folded receipt. The kind of thing no diplomat would ever be caught reading on an international flight, but he wasn't here as a diplomat. He was here as a man making his way home, nothing more, nothing less. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, offering smiles to familiar faces. There were quiet nods between cabin crew and passengers who flew this route often, corporate executives, policy consultants, industry magnates. It was, in many ways, an airborne boardroom, and Ibrahim Traore, with his calm gaze and humble posture, did not quite fit the usual mold. That was the point. Just minutes before the final call, a disruption broke the rhythm. The late arriving passenger stormed into the cabin with the air of someone who had never been told no. He was tall, tan, and impeccably dressed in an expensive blazer and designer jeans. The scent of cologne announced him before his voice did, loud, insistent, annoyed. A French CEO, known in the energy sector, though few outside corporate circles would know his name. But everyone on that flight would remember him soon enough. Say ridicule, he barked at the young flight attendant trailing nervously behind him. I fly this route every month. You tell me there is no business class left? Not even 1A. I'm so sorry, monsieur, she stammered. All the seats are occupied. We tried to reach you earlier. Non, he cut her off sharply, gesturing with a gold-ringed hand. You make it work. Move someone. I'm not sitting back there. His voice had drawn the attention of the cabin. Passengers peeked over headrests, eyebrows raised. Some annoyed, some entertained. Others, merely curious. Traoré didn't look up. He turned a page in his book and waited. The young flight attendant whispered something to a senior colleague. Claire, a woman in her mid-40s with platinum blonde hair pulled tightly into a bun, her badge gleaming with years of service. She sighed, nodded, and stepped forward with the confidence of someone used to solving problems for the privileged. She scanned the cabin slowly, her eyes darting across faces. When she reached 2A, her gaze lingered. Her eyes moved over the modest jacket, the worn book, the dark skin, the quiet posture. She took a breath, then approached. Excuse me, sir, she said politely, but firmly. Would you mind terribly if we relocated you to economy? Just for this flight? There's been a situation. Traoré looked up calmly, closing the book gently around his finger. I'm afraid I would mind, he said, his tone soft but unshakably firm. I have a business class ticket, seat 2A. Just like everyone else. Claire paused, surprised by the measured response. She hesitated, then smiled tightly. Yes, of course, I understand. It's just that we have a guest who. I'm a guest too, he replied. And I'm already seated. There was no anger in his voice. Just clarity. Certainty. The nearby passengers had grown quiet, sensing the tension building like static in the air. The French CEO stood a few rows behind, watching with impatience, arms folded. Claire stiffened, then gave a shallow nod. Of course, she murmured, stepping away. But her eyes, narrow and searching, did not move on. Not yet. President Ibrahim Traoré turned back to his book. But this was no longer business as usual. The line between discomfort and discrimination had just begun to blur. And the storm, though silent for now, was just beginning to gather. Claire returned to the galley with tight steps, her polished shoes clicking faintly against the cabin floor. She didn't say a word at first, but the frustration was evident in the way she stacked the champagne glasses, how she adjusted the folds of her uniform as if trying to reassert control. The young attendant who had been trailing behind her approached cautiously. He refused, the girl whispered. Claire shot her a quick glance. Yes. Politely. But he refused. The French CEO, now leaning against the bulkhead divider with one arm crossed and the other gripping his phone, made no effort to hide his growing irritation. He checked his watch theatrically, let out a groan loud enough to carry down the aisle, and muttered something under his breath in French. Claire straightened her jacket and set her jaw. She was used to these last-minute requests, used to accommodating high-value passengers, smoothing over egos, and rearranging seating charts with subtle diplomacy. But something about this situation was different, and she was quickly deciding that the man in 2A didn't belong. Not in that seat. Not with that simple jacket. Not with that silent, self-contained presence that refused to bow to pressure. So she returned to the cabin, this time with more authority in her step. She scanned the other passengers, white business people in tailored suits, a couple in their 60s quietly reading newspapers, a tech consultant on his laptop. None of them drew her attention. None of them, she decided, would be appropriate to ask. Instead, Her eyes went straight to a young black man in seat 4C. He was no more than 30, dressed sharply in a navy blue blazer, sipping a glass of water while scrolling through his tablet. "Excuse me," Claire said gently, placing a hand on the headrest in front of him. "Would you be willing to move to economy for this flight? Just temporarily? We're in a bit of a bind." The man blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry. Why me?" She gave a small laugh, like it was nothing at all. "It's just that we have a very important last-minute guest and we're out of seats." He looked around the cabin, noticed that no one else had been asked. "I have a paid business class ticket." "Yes, of course," Claire replied quickly, her smile tight. "It's just that you seem, well, flexible." The young man hesitated. His jaw tightened. "No. I'll stay here." Claire nodded again, masking her irritation with faux understanding. "Of course. I understand completely." But she didn't try the woman in 3A, or the man in 2C, or anyone else who didn't fit a certain profile. One by one, she approached every black passenger in business class, 3 in total, including a middle-aged woman in a beige head wrap who looked both confused and deeply embarrassed by the request. Each of them refused, and each time, Claire retreated with growing tension in her shoulders and less warmth in her tone. President Traoré watched it all unfold in silence. He hadn't turned a single page of his book in the past 10 minutes. His eyes remained forward, his hands calm, but his mind was absorbing everything. The selective targeting. The uncomfortable glances. The rising tension in the air. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing into this moment, the unspoken belief, still alive in some, that appearance dictates value. Then Claire returned once more, this time walking past him toward the cockpit. She offered the CEO a hushed update as she passed. "Still working on it," she said apologetically. "We'll get you situated soon." The CEO scoffed. "This is absurd. I don't understand how you let people like that into business class in the first place." Claire didn't respond. But she didn't correct him, either. Traoré turned slowly and locked eyes with the young man in 4C, who gave him the briefest of nods. A silent acknowledgement. A shared recognition. They were all seeing it now. The passengers who had been quietly watching began to shift in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Some were beginning to understand the nature of the unfolding conflict, not a logistical dilemma, but a deeper, uglier undercurrent. And still, the man at the center of it, Traoré, sat with perfect stillness, not announcing himself, not raising his voice, but making it increasingly difficult for anyone to pretend nothing was wrong. This was no longer about a seat. This was about a standard. And the world, quietly watching from rows 1 through 6, was beginning to feel the tremor beneath the surface. The moment Claire stepped back into the business class cabin, she no longer carried the light facade of a hostess balancing diplomacy. Her shoulders were squared, her brow creased, and her gaze was purposeful. But instead of speaking to anyone directly, she began walking deliberately past each row, her eyes locking only with the passengers whose skin tone matched a pattern she had, perhaps unconsciously, committed to. She stopped once more at seat 2A. Traoré, still composed, lifted his eyes to meet hers. "Sir," she began, her tone now firmer, more clipped, "I understand that you feel you're entitled to this seat. But I have a very important guest who needs to be accommodated immediately. It would be greatly appreciated if you could cooperate." He blinked slowly. "I purchased this ticket with my own funds. I arrived early. I boarded without incident. What makes you believe I am not in the seat I paid for?" Claire hesitated, her mouth opening slightly as though to speak, but nothing came out. She wasn't prepared for that level of calm, for that quiet certainty in his voice. She tried again. "This is a difficult situation, and I'm simply asking for a little flexibility." Traoré leaned back slightly, his voice steady and low, but powerful. "Flexibility. I understand. But tell me something. Have you asked the gentleman in 1C? Or the man in 3A? Claire's face froze. "No, but..." "Then it seems your idea of flexibility has a pattern. One that conveniently applies only to passengers who look a certain way." There was a pause. The kind of pause that fills a space with more tension than shouting ever could. Traore wasn't being aggressive, he wasn't even raising his voice. But the weight of his words was unmistakable. People began to stir again. Newspapers rustled, headphones slipped off ears. The businessman in 3A looked up for the first time, eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the front of the cabin. "I don't appreciate the implication," Claire said, her voice suddenly thinner. "And I don't appreciate the assumption," Traore replied evenly. "You've approached 3 passengers to move. All 3 are black. None are seated incorrectly. None broke any rules. Yet you've bypassed every other option. Why?" She shifted her weight. "Sir, I am only trying to manage a difficult passenger situation." "No," he said, his voice suddenly gaining a new sharpness. "You are managing appearances, not logistics. You've made assumptions. You have applied pressure selectively. And now you're uncomfortable because someone is noticing out loud." Her mouth opened again, this time with no words to fill the silence. She turned quickly and walked back toward the front of the cabin, where the CEO was still leaning against the wall, arms crossed like a king awaiting tribute. He raised his eyebrows. "Is it done?" She shook her head. "They are refusing." "They?" he repeated, scoffing. "Who are they, exactly?" Claire didn't respond. Instead, she stormed into the cockpit to speak with the captain. Meanwhile, a ripple of awareness spread through the cabin. Passengers who had initially looked away were now paying full attention. The woman in 4A leaned over to whisper something to her husband. The tech consultant paused his podcast. Even the flight attendants at the back of business class were exchanging worried glances. Traore remained still. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply existed in a truth that had made others deeply uncomfortable, that dignity does not require spectacle, and that justice often begins with stillness. In row 4, the young man who had earlier been asked to move gave a slow, almost reverent nod. Traore glanced out the window, watching as the last baggage containers were loaded onto the plane. The captain made no announcement. The doors remained open. Time stretched thin. At that moment, it was clear, this wasn't just about a CEO and a seat. It was about something far older, far deeper. It was about who is expected to yield and who is automatically respected. And it was about what happens when someone, without shouting, without status on display, refuses to yield. The business class cabin had become more than a place of luxury. It had become a mirror. And in that mirror, everyone was beginning to see themselves. Claire returned to the cabin with a tighter expression than before, but her composure was now visibly cracked. Her steps, once graceful and polished, now carried an edge of frustration and haste. The French CEO followed a few paces behind her, still wearing that look of confident entitlement, as if the resolution of this inconvenience was just moments away and would, as always, fall in his favor. Claire approached Traore again, standing just a bit straighter this time, her eyes flickering with discomfort, but her voice more formal. "Sir," she said, "this is now a matter of flight security. The captain has been informed. I'm afraid I'll need you to cooperate and relocate your seat so that we may avoid any delays." Traore didn't move. He looked up, calm as ever, and said in a voice that carried weight without force, "On what basis am I being removed from my assigned seat?" Claire faltered. We have a VIP guest who must be seated here. You were selected." "Selected?" he interrupted, a subtle smile at the corner of his lips. "Tell me something. Is there a list you consult when selecting which paying customers to remove from their rightful seats? Or is this selection process based on something less official, something more visual?" A few seats away, the tech consultant shook his head slowly. He wasn't the only one. A murmur passed through the cabin. What was once a quiet incident at the front of the plane had now become a growing cloud of awareness and quiet dissent. A few passengers began recording with their phones, subtly but clearly. The atmosphere was shifting. Claire, visibly flustered now, looked around as if realizing the tide was no longer turning in her favor. Her voice dropped lower, more pleading. "Please, sir. This is causing a disruption." Traore sat still. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward the young black man in row 4, the one who had earlier been asked to give up his seat. Their eyes met. "It's not we who caused this disruption," Traore said, this time loud enough for several rows to hear. It is the quiet assumption that some passengers are worth more than others. That some faces belong in front, and others are more suited to the back. That's the real disruption, one the world has tolerated for far too long. The cabin became silent. Even the CEO, for all his arrogance, paused for a moment. He looked at Traore, then scanned the surrounding passengers, many of whom were no longer hiding their disapproval. Claire swallowed hard and walked briskly to the front, this time without a word. She entered the cockpit again, closing the door behind her. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, the door opened. The captain emerged, his face neutral but focused. He walked down the aisle, directly to Traoré's seat. "Sir," he said, in a measured tone, "I've reviewed the situation. Your ticket and boarding pass are in order. You have every right to remain where you are. I apologize for any misunderstanding." With that, he turned and addressed the French CEO. "I'm afraid we cannot accommodate your request, sir. You'll need to return to your assigned seat. If you are unable to do so, we'll have to proceed with off-boarding procedures and rebook you on another flight." The CEO's mouth hung open slightly, as though no one had ever spoken to him like that on European soil. He muttered something under his breath, turned, and stalked angrily back toward economy, his suit jacket flaring like a cape behind him. A quiet cheer went up, subtle, restrained, but present. Someone clapped once, then twice, and soon a soft round of applause filled the cabin. Not loud. Not mocking. Just real. Genuine. Traore nodded once, but didn't smile. He wasn't basking in victory. This was not a triumph to him, it was a reckoning. One long overdue. As calm returned, the passengers settled in, their expressions changed. The mood had shifted, not because of drama, but because of truth. Quiet, dignified, undeniable truth. And still, not one person on that flight knew who he was. Not the CEO, not Claire, not even the captain. To them, he was just another passenger who stood his ground. But soon, the world would know. And when they did, the shock wouldn't come from his title. It would come from the realization that prejudice had dared to question the dignity of a sitting African president, one who had asked for nothing more than respect, and gave in return a lesson none aboard that plane would ever forget. The hush that fell over the cabin lingered long after the captain returned to the cockpit. People settled back into their seats, but no one quite returned to the comfort they had boarded with. Something had changed in the air, an awareness, a discomfort, maybe even shame, for those who had looked the other way at first. But amidst it all, President Ibrahim Traoré remained still, composed, eyes resting on the window as clouds drifted by like silent witnesses. 2 rows behind him, the young African man who had been asked earlier to move was still looking at him, not with confusion now, but with admiration. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. That moment had cracked something open in the hearts of several passengers. Not a speech, not a protest, just calm resistance to something that had always been normalized. Claire returned with a tray of drinks and moved carefully past Traoré's row, avoiding eye contact. She smiled stiffly at the white passengers in business class, offering champagne and snacks, her hands slightly trembling. But as she reached the young black man who had been previously targeted, her face hardened. She offered nothing. Not even a glance. As he stood and reached for his bag, the young man behind him hesitated, then said, "Thank you, for not just speaking for me, but for showing me how to carry myself when others doubt my place." Traoré turned and gave him a firm, warm look. "Never let their doubt become your burden," he said. "Let your dignity make them question their own assumptions." And with that, he walked calmly down the aisle, no entourage, no VIP escort, just a man who had held the entire cabin accountable with nothing more than stillness and truth. The moment he stepped out of the plane, the bright flash of cameras from a waiting diplomatic reception illuminated the runway. The press was there. The embassy was there. A red carpet had been rolled out in haste after officials learned he was on board. Passengers standing in the jet bridge gasped in recognition. Some pulled out phones. Others stared in silence as the man they had almost dismissed stepped onto the carpet without so much as a glance back. And for those who had witnessed what happened in the air, it hit them all at once. This wasn't just a flight. It was a lesson. And for some, It would echo for the rest of their lives. Back inside the terminal, Claire stood near the service counter, watching through the glass as the president's convoy pulled away. She didn't cry. But her eyes were red, not from shame alone, but from awakening. She had been given something rare, not humiliation, but the gift of confrontation with her own blindness. A chance to grow. And for Traoré, it had been just another day of resistance. Not through protest. Not through fury. But through grace. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sits quietly in 2A, holding the world accountable. One gaze, one word, one silent refusal at a time. Traoré turned to watch her. She paused when she realized he was observing. Their eyes met for the briefest second, hers filled with discomfort, his with something deeper, a quiet, piercing truth. "You are still making choices with the same eyes," he said, barely loud enough to be heard by those in nearby seats. Claire stopped in her tracks. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice curt. "I mean," he continued evenly, "you are still deciding who is worthy based on skin before service. That's not a mistake. That's a belief system." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some avoided looking at her, others leaned in, wanting to hear more. The air was tense, but it was not angry. It was awakening. "Do you know who he is?" the tech consultant finally asked aloud, gesturing toward Traoré. Claire hesitated. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant because you've spent the last hour undermining him, pressuring him, and questioning his place," the man replied. "And not once did you ask for his name, did you? You just assumed." "I treat all passengers equally," Claire said defensively. A woman across the aisle scoffed softly. "No, you don't. We all saw who you asked to move. Who you skipped with the champagne. Equality doesn't skip rows." Claire stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting to each face now turned toward her, no longer indifferent. Something inside her unraveled, a sudden realization of how deeply she'd misread not only the man before her but the very situation unfolding around her. Traoré did not raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand apology or recognition. Instead, he gently reached into his jacket and pulled out his diplomatic passport. Calmly, without flair, he handed it to the young man behind him. The man opened it, eyes widening instantly. He stood up slowly and turned to the rest of the cabin. "This man you all just saw being asked to move to economy, this man who was treated like he didn't belong, is President Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Claire's mouth parted, then closed again. She looked stunned, pale, as if the oxygen had been sucked from the cabin. The French CEO, from far back in the economy section, peered over the seat in front of him with wide eyes. He looked betrayed by the moment, like power itself had deceived him by hiding in the humility of the man he tried to displace. But Traoré simply nodded and reclaimed his passport. "I am not offended that she didn't recognize me," he said. "I am saddened that even without knowing who I was, she believed I was lesser." He looked around the cabin, locking eyes with strangers who now saw him very differently, not because of his title, but because of the strength he had displayed without once raising his voice. "This seat, this flight, this moment, none of it matters as much as the truth we walk with," he continued. "Some people will always believe their value is higher. But true power is in how we carry ourselves when we are underestimated." With that, he sat back. Not another word. Not another demand. Just presence. Unshaken. And the silence that followed was no longer awkward. It was reverent. Because in that moment, everyone on that plane understood. Power doesn't need to shout. Sometimes, it simply sits in 2A, waiting to be seen. The cabin remained hushed, suspended in the stillness that only truth can bring. Claire stood there, suddenly feeling more exposed than ever before. Her uniform, once a shield of authority, now felt like a costume. She looked around and saw not judgmental faces, but ones awakened by what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about her misstep anymore, it was about what that misstep represented. She walked slowly to the back of the cabin, pausing only once to glance at the French CEO seated in economy. He looked away, pretending to scroll through his phone, though his hand trembled slightly. His silence was now the loudest noise in the room. The champagne he had been sipping felt sour in his mouth. His entitlement, once a badge of status, now weighed heavily like shame. Meanwhile, Traoré's quiet strength continued to ripple outward like waves in still water. The young African man behind him sat straighter now, not out of pride but out of respect. Others began whispering, but the tone had changed, from gossip to reverence. From disbelief to admiration. The captain emerged once more from the cockpit, having been briefed. He approached Traoré cautiously, eyes filled with regret. He bent slightly at the waist, offering a subtle bow. "Mr. President, on behalf of Air France, I apologize for the disrespect shown to you," he said. "Had we known?" "You shouldn't have to know someone's title to treat them with dignity," Traoré replied gently. The captain stood there a moment, uncertain how to respond. Then he gave a quiet nod and returned to the cockpit, saying nothing more. Back in the crew area, Claire sat on a small fold-down seat, her face buried in her hands. She had built her entire professional persona on precision, poise, and protocol. And yet, in one afternoon, she had become a symbol of something else entirely, something uglier. Not because she was malicious, but because she had been blind. Blind to her own bias, blind to her own assumptions, blind to the humanity in front of her. For the rest of the flight, she moved about quietly, doing her duties with a humility she had never known before. She offered drinks now without choosing who seemed deserving. She smiled with sincerity, not obligation. She didn't speak to President Traoré again, but her silence now was no longer one of indifference. It was apology in its truest, quietest form. As the plane began its descent, the tension dissolved into something else, reflection. The passengers no longer saw just a man in seat 2A. They saw a mirror. A challenge. A reminder of what it means to truly see someone. When the wheels touched down on the tarmac, a murmur went through the cabin as people prepared to disembark. Traoré remained seated, allowing others to leave before him. The French CEO rushed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. But others paused, looked at Traoré with a small nod, a thankful glance, a silent acknowledgement.